So at the Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore, our main task is to conduct research in the field of agent-based transport demand simulation. This has nothing to do directly with the planning, how you do organize your mobility in cities, but to develop tools that allow you to test different planning scenarios and compare them against each other. So the first step of all this is to implement such a simulation. It can be easily understood by saying, so you have your population in Barcelona is like 2 million people, in the bigger area in Singapore is 5 million people, and each of those persons we have a code in a database, and that, or a line in that database, and that line says who you are, with whom you live, where you live, your income, your sex, whether you have a driving license, where you work, whether you work, whether you go to your education, kind of what the type of person you are, with all relevant attributes with regards to mobility. And with this, and knowing where job locations are, where activity locations are, restaurants, bars, football stadiums, airports, and so on, we can then simulate on an individual level an entire city or even countries such as Switzerland with 7 million people in a computer. And this allows us to test different scenarios. So what happens if you add a new MRT line? What happens if you rearrange the land use? What happens if you come up with some new transport policy, restrict car use or different parking policy? Or looking into the future, how many autonomous cars would you need if you wanted to replace all cars in the city and just ban privately owned cars, but it's only Google car? I did some obviously desktop research before as I got invited. Before I came here, I did some desktop research, and it appears as if there are similar problems as in many other big urban agglomerations in Europe. So first is that there has been considerable urban sprawl. So it's not that kind of the most of new residential developments have been built up at the borders of the city, but more at the outskirts and like sprawling villages. And living there means owning at least one car and using it. Obviously there are the commuter trains that go in radial ways, but already if you live like 2 kilometers away from that train stations, people normally don't bother to first take a bus, which might have like low frequency every 15 minutes or half an hour. So they just buy a car, and jobs tend to be still concentrated in the kind of inner area. And then what you end up is kind of congestion in the morning, congestion in the evening in the different ways. What I was a bit surprised is that there is so little bicycle usage for whatever reason. I saw that there are there are intentions, but also first implementations of like bicycling infrastructure, such as bicycling lanes, but it seems to be quite little. Given the climate that you have here, which is wonderful for cycling almost all year round, given that the city, at least in the inner area, is pretty flat, I wonder why there is so little cycling usage. From what we know from other cities is that people don't cycle if they feel it's not safe. And given that the main arterial roads like Diagonal seem to be quite car-oriented, okay, they are also congested, I think the difficult thing is this trade-off, because if you take room away from kind of car space but allocate it to cycling, obviously the car lobby will go mad and will complain. On the other hand, we know that a meter or like 2 meters of cycling lane has much higher capacity in terms of how many people you actually get through than a car lane. So it is spatial efficient to have bicycle lanes. The problem is if you have just, let's say, one or two, it does not really work. As people, or those people who are not cycling because of safety concerns, would only go or would decide based on the weakest link. So if you have like a long cycling route, and then you have some 2 or 3 kind of hotspots, like big junctions where there is no proper cycling infrastructure, they would still think, well, no, that's too dangerous for me, I wouldn't cycle. So it's really important that you have a connected network, so that people feel safe and then start cycling from the entire trip. Just like some lanes that don't help. I wouldn't know any other city that is better suited for cycling in Europe. I mean, obviously the Copenhagens and the Amsterdams, they have put in place this superb infrastructure, but Barcelona, with this, at least the grid by Jeddah, which is reasonably spaced blocks for cycling use, the network, it seems all in place. It's just someone needs to get it started really.